Welcome to a new edition of the Steeple Report. We are very happy to welcome Stephen Lentz, the author of the book Over My Shoulder, The Business of Church. So welcome, Stephen.
Oh, it's good to be here. Thank you for having me, Rich.
So, as I often do, give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to the viewers, maybe a little background about how and where you grew up, your education, your introduction to church, your coming to faith. Anything you want to share with us would be wonderful, and then we'll get into a little discussion.
Well, even though nobody reads Reader's Digest anymore, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. But really met the Lord in 1972 in law school at William and Mary in Williamsburg, and that started an entire reorientation of my entire life toward Matthew 6:33, which is seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all your needs will be added unto you. So all of my career has basically followed that plan and put me into some wonderful opportunities that I never could have scripted, myself. I am one of the former senior vice presidents for the Family Channel. And when I was head of ad sales worldwide for them, I ran their offices in New York, Chicago, Detroit, LA, London, and Hong Kong. And then when we sold to Murdoch in the late 90s, I became president of Middle East Television, ran the largest superstation in the Middle East, lived in and out of Israel. But my station was actually in the war zone in Lebanon, had 72 employees, and 32 were Shiite Muslim guards, fully armed, which made personnel decisions very deliberative, because I had to disarm the employees before we could fire them. And so
that's a unique experience.
And I wrote a second book off of that experience. It's called Bulletproof: Business Protection Strategies from the War Zone. And maybe someday we can circle back and go through that one. But I learned a lot of lessons about how to do business, when you are being shot at or could be shot at. And last time I checked, anytime you try to do anything important in life, you have walked onto a battlefield. And so that's what that whole book's about. So the Hezbollah overran our positions in the early 2000s, and that job ended. And that's when I opened up a law firm here in Virginia. And I really have a national practice and an international practice. I'm a complex business lawyer, and a subset of that is nonprofits, and a subset of that is church. And because of my love for the Lord and my love for the local church, we have found a tremendous endorsement by clients throughout America. I have clients in all 50 states, thousands of churches, spanning pretty much every denomination, every movement, and the emerging church world. In addition to that, I'm an ordained pastor, and I tell my friends, I wasn't sure I could get into heaven as a lawyer, so I decided I would go ahead and get my ordination just to hedge my bets. So
can we do a lawyer joke here, or just let that go?
If you got one, you can throw it out.
No, I'll refrain.
So what we found, though, is the book that's over your shoulder, The Business of Church, really originated because we are representing churches all over America in virtually every denomination. And what we found is that most pastors are ill-equipped for the business component of their calling. When they go to seminary, they're going to learn, all of the theology and the preaching and all of that, but they're really not prepared for business. And I have a friend who's a psychologist who works with burned out pastors all over America. And he asks them, when he begins to work with them, why did you ever get in ministry? And invariably they say, I wanted to preach the Bible and I wanted to help people. The reality, according to my psychologist friend, is that 85% of a pastor's day is really business. And because the pastors are woefully ill-equipped to be able to deal with that part of things, they stuff it. And according to my sources, that causes all kinds of aberrant behavior over a long period of time. We're just not equipped to be failing in our core responsibility day after day, week after week, month after month, sometimes year after year, without something bad happening. And so I wrote this as a handbook. I'm working with some of the seminaries right now to develop it into a course. But my publisher said, Steve, this needs to be longer. And I said, you don't understand my audience. This is for pastors. They don't have time to read a treatise or a textbook, but they need some kind of a handbook that will lead them through some very important areas that can make or break their career, their church, and as long as they're aware of these areas, they can go then and manage them. They can find help. And so that's what the business of church is all about, is just to be a handbook for pastors and church leaders.
Well, we can maybe have a separate conversation, because that has a lot to do with my primary occupation, where we work with all different kinds of churches, but largely African American churches that are looking to reimagine their physical assets and how they show up in their communities for doing more, contributing more impact to their communities through a better utilization of their physical assets.
Yeah.
Which again goes back to your point that we often find that a pastor may have a dream, a vision unto himself for something, but when it's not rooted in the reality of what does redevelopment look like, what does financing look like, what does your capital stack look like, what does all the legalities, so like you said, a lot of times they're not equipped through their educational experience to do that. Oftentimes they can find themselves in a bind of who to trust to be a trusted
Yeah.
advisor
Right.
to help them achieve what they're trying to achieve. And so, to dig into your book a little bit, I mean, we could start at the very beginning, where you discuss the importance of one of the first decisions, which is your corporate structure.
Sure.
And you had mentioned like the unincorporated versus the incorporated, and how those different formation types have a dramatic effect on how the church is protected, how it does. I hate to use the word "does business," but how
Right.
it operates. So maybe
Sure.
you can dig into those two.
Sure. Yeah. As we've worked with churches throughout America, um, we've I represent denominations as well as individual churches, and in many cases, churches have started in a home and then developed into a real enterprise, and there is a need. I urge churches to be incorporated. The reason is because an unincorporated church is probably the most vulnerable, most porous of exposure to the leaders and to the assets of the church. That if the church is not incorporated, then they're run by trustees. And in some cases, if something goes wrong in that, the trustees are personally liable, and the pastor and the board are personally liable, which I don't know about you, but the last time I checked, it's tough enough to get a good leadership group without saying, and by the way, by being part of the leadership group of my church, now all of your personal assets are exposed. That's kind of a non-starter. Theologically, a lot of times, I'll run into an argument to say, well, we don't want the state involved in our business. This is religion. And it doesn't take very long of a discussion for me to explain to the leaders of the church, the state's already involved in your business. that's where you get the designation unincorporated association. And so if you're an unincorporated association, the state codes basically operate in a distrust paradigm. They feel like you need extra oversight because you're not incorporated. So in an unincorporated association, the pastor can say we want to sell the property. The congregants can all vote unanimously we want to sell the property. The trustees can say we want to sell the property. You still can't do it. You have to go to court and get the court's approval because they don't trust you because you're unincorporated. And so it's the most intrusive form of contact with the state if you're unincorporated. Once you become incorporated, now you're governed by, again, same state code that said you were unincorporated, but now your board of directors, your bylaws will govern how you do business, and you don't have to go to the court and get their permission. And the pastor, the elders are not personally liable unless there's, malfeasance or something illegal going on. But in the normal day-to-day rhythm of the business of church, it takes everybody's personal liability off the table. And so I think it's very important that a church incorporate to protect not only the leadership, but also the people and those assets going downstream.
What you're explaining is often referred to as the corporate shield.
Yes.
To mitigate liabilities by individuals. Now, just for clarity's sake, maybe you want to just put some minds at ease how incorporating and maintaining a not-for-profit status are not mutually exclusive.
Well, yeah, first of all, and it's not only not for profit, but it's also tax exempt. So,
right.
Yeah, you can form a nonprofit corporation and not be tax exempt. And so, the reality is under the First Amendment of the Constitution, churches are automatically tax exempt. They don't have to get permission from anybody. They don't need a letter from the IRS. And so by incorporating, you're not becoming more tax exempt or less tax exempt. You're a church. And so if you're a valid church and there's a 14-point test that the IRS has, you are tax exempt. However, many of our churches will go ahead and file what's called a Form 1023 and get that letter back from the IRS because it's easier to navigate on the ground when people are asking, well, if you're tax exempt, show me the letter. It's harder to say, well, actually, I'll show you the Constitution. Or if there's a significant presence of internationals in your church, the INS doesn't care about the Constitution. They want to see that letter. Many times in your construction projects, showing that letter can save you money on materials and supplies and everything. So, but the point is that when you incorporate a church, you incorporate as a nonprofit in Virginia. It's called a non-stock corporation, and then the next step is you can go ahead and file for your actual recognition letter, and you're filing for a recognition of exemption, and that title is very important. Because what the IRS is doing is their letter doesn't make you exempt. Their letter recognizes that you are exempt because of what you do. And so you get a letter of recognition of exemption from a determination letter from the IRS, and that's a good thing to have on file. So the incorporation process is fairly simple. You land on a set of bylaws that the church government, the polity of the church, is incorporated in that. And one of the things we talk about in the book is to beware of the cut and paste mentality. A lot of folks will borrow documents, from.
I was going to get into that. Yeah. I'm glad you brought it up.
And it's very dangerous because your bylaws really need to incorporate your actual theology, polity, the way you're going to do business in your church. And so, it's important, and it sounds self-serving, but there's no other way to say it. it's important to go to an expert when you're talking about forming church documents, because these are documents that are going to serve you throughout the history of the church. So I have many churches that have gone to a corporate lawyer and have asked to get incorporated, and they get a corporation. But the corporation is templated, and it really doesn't speak to the way they do church, the way they make decisions. It doesn't have their language in it. Some use deacons, some use elders, some use board of directors. Some have staff elders who can't be directors, but none of that's in the document. And because the corporate lawyer doesn't understand church. And then I have other churches who have gone to a well-meaning congregant who happens, unfortunately, to be a lawyer, and they say incorporate our church. Well, again, not every lawyer understands corporate law. There are many kinds of lawyers. So there are family lawyers, and we've got in our firm, we've got litigators. I'm a transactional attorney. It was a hilarious day when I had to go to court with one of my partners on the matter. And I don't go to court because I'm the transactional one. And so he introduces me. The judge has never seen me before. And he says, Judge, this is Stephen D. Lentz. He's, one of the partners of our firm. And he's a transactional attorney, which basically telling the judge, this guy didn't know anything about being in the courtroom.
You had your my cousin Vinny moment.
Exactly. Yeah. So you wouldn't want me to represent you in trial. That's why I have a firm with litigators. But it's the same way. Just because a person in your congregation is a lawyer doesn't mean he knows anything about corporate law or how to blend the religious polity of your church into. So you need to go to a church law authority, and by God's grace, because I think I'm one of less than 3 lawyers in America who really cross denominations. Some will serve a certain denomination or a certain movement, but we really have the privilege of being able to touch virtually every denomination in America. So when we get that, we don't want to change the church. We just want to make it better. So I want to hear what that polity is. Some are hierarchical. Everything starts at the national office, comes straight down. Some are voluntary association of sovereign independent churches, which is the Assemblies of God. And it's important to hear, how they do church. So I talk about in the book that years ago I had my knee replaced. It was a basketball injury. I wish I could say that it was because I was great at basketball, but I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The guy blew my knee out. And over the years, I really didn't have it treated. So I was more and more lame and bow-legged in this right leg as the knee was deteriorating. So when it came time to get my knee replaced, I did not go to my dentist. He has a medical degree, but he doesn't know anything about knees. I went to,
orthopedic.
Shout out to Dr. Carter, and he does zip surgery and he knows knees. And so when we get into space, I try to encourage churches, please don't take this to a well-meaning corporate attorney who's going to create something in a vacuum, doesn't know anything about what you're doing or understand church, or don't go to an attorney who doesn't know anything about corporate law. It's best to find both. And that's where we found real meaning and application in the marketplace for our faith.
And then you went on to even get more specific, delineating between the church and ministry. And then I could tack on something extra, which is a lot of churches have a separate, like CDC or something of that nature, which is a different entity. And I think, depending on who's involved, they often allow them to bleed into one another too much and have the same board for all of them and have, they just, like you said, they just take a boilerplate and try to move it around when really they're very individual entities with very different purposes and are recognized legally differently. So maybe you could touch on that a bit.
That's a great point. No, it's a very good point that I mentioned before. Churches are automatically tax exempt according to the Constitution. Ministries are not. And a CDC, would not be automatically tax exempt. So when you're forming a ministry, you have to file that 1023 recognition of exemption with the IRS for them to give you the recognition letter, the determination letter. And again, filing the 1023, I think we've done thousands, over the last 30 years. And thankfully 100% success rate. We've never had one rejected. But as these different ministries come in, or a Christian school, if it's not directly under the church, or a community development corporation or something like that, or dream centers. I represent several dream centers throughout the country. They have their own reality. And the way that the bylaws are drafted, matter when the reviewer is going to look at that project. And generally, if it's a brand new entity, you have to give 3 years of a projected budget. And it's important that you can file it yourself. Somebody can go online and download it and everything and file the forms. However, everything you say then is forever permanent record. And to me, the art of being able to file a successful 1023 recognition of exemption for a church or a ministry is in its brevity. You don't say everything that you're thinking. You don't give every dream that you're ever thinking of. I try to put myself in the place of that first level reviewer. I want it to be so boring that the reviewer can say, yeah, this is fine. I hope they make it, and they pass it on. And so it's hard for people to understand that. I had a pastor come in from, a city here in Tidewater, Virginia, and he had filed his own recognition of exemption 10.3, and it had been rejected. And he was really befuddled. And so he brought it in, and I looked at his application. This was a church of probably under 50 people, whose footprint did not go out of its local municipality. But in its application, he talked about sex trafficking, rescuing victims, and he listed the countries, and every country he listed was on the watch list. And so his application went upstream, and you had Homeland Security involved. You had all kinds of folks involved. He says, I don't know what to do. And so I called the IRS and I explained it. I said, this was just a dream. They wanted to know, how are you going to ensure that your assets are not going to end up in the hands of the guerrillas in Somalia or whatever? And I explained, I said, they're not in Somalia. They're just in their little town. It was just a dream. And he said, well, you can amend it and everything, but that's going to stay on their permanent record. And so it took us.
I guess the more you divulge, while your intention may be to, express what your desire will be in the future, the more you divulge, the more you're actually categorizing yourselves and limiting your agility rather than making yourself more flexible and more agile.
Exactly.
You're actually hemming yourself into pigeonholes, which can, really get you in trouble.
And so that's where, and you mentioned the boards. It's important that the boards, of a church, and then if they have a ministry on the side, or if they have a Christian school, or if they have, they're all different kinds of a dream center or whatever. You don't want necessarily what's called interlocking boards, because that throws everything into one pot. And if something goes bad in one expression, it can actually affect the entire enterprise. And so again, that's where a good corporate lawyer, can really walk you through that, because it's straight corporate law at that point. Not taking your eye off the mission or the purpose or the true religious purpose of the organization, but understanding how all these things fit together so that you can do what God's called you to do. I mean, my mission is I want the church to be able to have the biggest footprint it can have in their community in all of its expressions. So just how do we do that? And there's got to be a lot of intentionality there.
Yeah, I mean, beyond the legalities of, avoiding interlocking boards, we often recommend separate boards for a different reason, which is that oftentimes churches have a tendency to be a bit insular, and by expanding your board outside of your normal church community, you're expanding your social capital, and you're able to invite people that would not necessarily be a member of your church, but they may share your passion for a particular ministry. And
That's right.
so you're able to draw upon expertise that may not reside within your small church community. So,
Yeah, that's right.
there's the
And
legal
there's a
side,
way.
and then there's, what can help you.
I think that's great. And also, if you're talking about a community development corporation, or if you're talking about, some kind of expression in the community that is humanitarian or whatever, there are gifts and grants available, but not to a church. And so again, trying to set up that independent board, but there are ways that we do it so that the church doesn't lose control of that enterprise, that the DNA can't somehow go astray. And you can stitch all that together through just good corporate governance. So, but that's a good point to bring up, Rich, and I think it's important for people to understand
I,
that there is a difference.
yeah. And since we're talking about boards, I love I guess it's a warning, but it's a great illustration of the worst case scenario. I guess it was um, a client, and you were interviewing the board members, and you found that one of their board members didn't really live up to your expectations. So maybe you want to tell that story. If
Well,
you,
there's a chapter in there about, don't give a gun to a novice, and it's the idea of good training for the board. And what a lot of people don't understand is that a board of a nonprofit tax exempt entity, whether it's incorporated or not, has a body of law sitting on it that it will be governed by. And the word is called a fiduciary. They have a fiduciary responsibility to operate in the best interest of the enterprise. And so that's an external test that will be given to a church or a ministry or anything along these lines. And so I was interviewing. What I do is when I'm called in to work with restructuring a church or updating their documents, I like to sit down with the control team and see, who the team is, who the executive team is. So it was way out in the western part of the country, and I was flown out there to meet with this church. And as I was sitting around the table, I was being introduced to the team, and they got to the treasurer and the comptroller, and she said, a very nice, unassuming, woman, middle-aged, and she said, well, first of all, I just want to thank Pastor Jones for giving me this great job since I got out of the penitentiary. And I'm looking around the table thinking this is a joke, right? But nobody's laughing. And so after the meeting, I took the pastor aside. I said, well, brother, tell me about Sister Smith. He says, oh yeah, she and her husband were convicted of money laundering and racketeering. But she didn't do it. She was just a unwitting pawn. And I really wanted to reinforce to her that we believe that God is a God of new beginnings. And I said, well, brother, that is a wonderful pastoral thought. You have a great pastor's heart. Unfortunately, it's not a president's thought, and you are the president of the corporation. And you cannot have a convicted felon as your treasurer in handling the money in this corporation. That violates your fiduciary responsibility. And so again, wearing both hats, great pastor hat, terrible president hat. And so understanding, who the board can be and can't be is just part of the education of the board.
when you talked about fiduciary responsibilities, you broke it down into three segments or tests, I guess you could call them: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. Maybe you could explain, how each of those is thought of and implemented, to make sure that a board is doing what they're supposed to be doing, or to use these
Yeah,
words,
I will.
doing their duty.
And by the way, thanks for reading the book, Richard. I appreciate the actually read this. But again, this is law that is placed on boards, whether they know it or not. And the whole idea of this chapter in the book is to say, listen, a board member, just because they're your friend doesn't make them a good board member, or just because they're your golfing buddy, or because you guys hang out at art shows or whatever, that the board members have responsibilities that are placed on them no matter what. And these three duties are absolutely sacred inside the fiduciary world. The duty of care is basically saying that a board member has to be informed. And so if you have a board member who basically doesn't understand a simple financial report, or is not keeping abreast with the initiatives of the church or the organization, they're violating the duty of care, which is basically there is a duty to stay informed with the corporation or with the entity, and understand the facts, the consequences of all the decisions. And so that's the duty of care. The duty of loyalty means that basically the directors have to always operate in the best interest of the organization. So again, this isn't your personal piggy bank. This isn't everybody basically taking tax exempt money, which is a special designation of trust given to us out of privilege in our American law, and use it for your own personal gain or your own personal agenda. I had a pastor, again, out in the Midwest, who called me, and he'd taken over. He was the second pastor. The founder had retired, and the founder had been retired for some years, and this pastor had taken over. It was incorporated. Now he was the new president. And so he called me and he said, we were trying to do a building program, but the bank said I needed to have an attorney look at our deed. I said, why? And he said, well, can I send it to you? And so he sent me the deed to the property. Well, the founder had deeded the property in his own name, which is private inurement. You can't do that. This is not, you don't own this entity. It's owned by no one. It's a public trust run by a board of directors for the privilege of the congregants. And so that violated 501c3 rules and would have removed the tax exemption for the whole enterprise. So I called the pastor up, the founder, and I said, I'm sure you didn't intend to do this, just a mistake. We just need to do a transfer deed out of your name into the church's name. He said, no, I meant to do that. I meant for my sons to inherit this property of this church as one of their assets.
Oh boy.
I said, you can't do that. I said that's a violation of your duty of loyalty to operate always in the best interest of the church, not your personal interest. And so, to make a long story short, we worked it out. It took me over a year to convince him to do the right thing rather than be disgraced. But the duty of loyalty is we're operating in the best interest of this enterprise. And so not in your own personal interest. And then the duty of obedience is to make sure that you're complying with all the laws. And I would say that in the day and age we live in right now, especially with the First Amendment freedoms and the discussion of different social activity and behavior now that is coming into the church, you can be in violation of Title VII, or we have an Equality Act here in Virginia that makes LGBTQ, a civil right now. And so the letter of the law, for instance, in our state, in many of the states, is that you can't hire or fire or discriminate based on sexual orientation. That's duty of obedience. However, there is a carve out, and it's the First Amendment freedom of religion. And so the Supreme Court last summer passed 6-4 to say there's a ministerial exception. If you're a faith organization and you have a statement of faith that clearly says this is part of your core beliefs, sincerely held religious beliefs, then you can discriminate based on your religious beliefs because of the First Amendment. So now every church, every ministry, every Christian school needs to have their bylaws reviewed and their statement of faith to make sure that there's language in there that says what you believe about these social issues. In the old days, we used to be able to say, I'm a church, I believe the Bible. It doesn't work that way anymore. Now it's, what do you believe about the Bible? So for instance, we have special language we've drafted for our churches, talks about marriage, and it talks about, for the churches that care about this, that marriage is an institution ordained by God. It's not a fad. It's not a custom that changes, between one man and one woman. Then, believe it or not, we define what a man and a woman are. And then we talk about sexual orientation, because now part of the issue is, well, I identify as a man or I identify as a woman. And so now we have a whole section in the bylaws that says, we believe your biological identity at birth is your sexual identity.
And then there are those churches that, are open to gay marriage and are, much more amenable to.
They're more liberal.
Yeah.
And the important thing for the church is to say,
so whatever it is, you're just stating your beliefs. Yeah.
Right. But if this matters to you, it better be in your bylaws.
Right.
Because then if you're saying to someone, I'm going to remove you from staff because we're an evangelical, traditional Christian church that believes in the traditional definition of marriage, and it's in our bylaws, and now you've come out and said that you are, you want to have same-sex marriage, you're not going to be able to work here. If you don't have that in the bylaws,
put that in the writing, right?
Then you're in a Title VII moment. So this duty of obedience, which is complying with the law, feathers into the discussion now of the First Amendment freedoms we have in our churches. And we do that. We revise bylaws for churches all over the country.
When we talk about all these things, it just naturally segues into another part of your book, which is the importance of board training. And I'll read them just to save a shorthand here, that you focus on basically 5 broader topics: board and trustee procedures, financial practices statements, transactional disclosures, conflicts of interest, human resources, and use and management of resources. I mean, in a corporate environment, those are pretty everyday types of things that a corporate board would do reflexively. In a church, sometimes I think some churches are more structured than others. That's but I think these 5 areas are so important because they cover not only on the liability side, but just good management. When you're talking about eliminating conflicts of interest and you're focused on, human resources, which is a broad area, these are just good management things that your board needs to have. If not personal expertise, they need to have resources that they can pull on and know that they're important issues for them to be well versed in.
That's right. And that duty of obedience is assuming that they do know that, and they'll be judged by that. Right.
What do you find? I mean, because you have a pretty broad segment, different denominations, different types of churches. What do you find are the things that are not being done that are coming up and biting the most churches? What's being neglected the most? Do you have anything that jumps to mind?
Well, of course, the initial incorporation versus unincorporation is a big deal, and that's a Swiss cheese formula for liability, for everyone. I think, in the area of consistency of application of what you believe is a big deal. And again, because pastors by nature are relational, they're not necessarily going to like the idea of having rules and regulations that apply indiscriminately, without favoritism. So not applying everything equally to everybody, I think, can get people into trouble. And then not having things in writing. As a complex business lawyer, I will tell you that it's very important for contracts, leases, employment agreements to be written down, because if something happens to one of the key players, nobody knows it's happening. And it's amazing what happens when you see things in writing and you think you had an understanding. You say, oh, I didn't mean that, and so I think having things in writing is a very important part of things. There's a section in here on intellectual property. And
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up.
Yeah,
Which that was a thing I hadn't really thought of that much as it pertains to church. So that particular chapter really was interesting to me.
Yeah, as a former television president, I'm pretty sensitized to that whole area. But I think people don't understand that there are intellectual property rights flowing all over the place. Let me start with a very simple. You're going to have somebody create a logo for you. Under common law, the originator of a work owns the work. So I hire a logo guy, and he creates a logo for me, and I pay him $50. Who owns the logo? Well, the originator of the work owns the work. That's the logo guy.
Yeah,
So
I think the common man assumption would be, well, I paid for it, so therefore it's mine.
Yeah. So what did I just pay for? Well, without there being an agreement, it's called a work for hire agreement that says logo guy is transferring ownership for that $50. You don't get ownership. You have a license to use his logo. So I have nonprofits who have come in and had their websites designed, paid thousands of dollars, and the next year they get another bill for thousands of dollars. And they'll come in and they'll say, Steve, we paid this guy last year to create a website, and we paid him thousands of dollars. I said, well, could you show me the agreement that you have between them? And he said, well, we don't have an agreement. We just paid him, and I said, well, guess what? You have a license to use his website. And now you have to pay him this year to use his website. And so that's intellectual property flowing between, properties. So, who owns the sermon I've talked about, because I represent mega churches, and these guys, have huge footprints, and many of them I'm one of the resources for a church that has 19 campuses. They produce books, and they produce CDs, and they produce videos. And the question is, who owns that sermon when the pastor preaches it and then reduces it to a CD, takes it out to a conference and sells it? Who owns that? There's intellectual property rights flowing. And a good lawyer answers, it depends. That there are at least three options of that. Number one is the church owns it, because the guy's on salary. He used the church's resources to create it, preach it.
Like a patent for a corporation. So they own it. While you're employed, the patent belongs to the corporation.
Right. However, he could have a license agreement where he says, listen, I would like to pay fair market value for this sermon, and I'll pay the cost of producing the CD and my time and everything, come up with a price. I will pay you a royalty, based on that. and then I'll take it out and I get everything over and above that. That's a license agreement. So still the church owns it, they're licensing it to the pastor. Then we have some other folks who basically have such a big footprint, they might have their own 501c3 as well as preaching at the church. The job description allows them to have both. And that's another contract that needs to be inside that size of a church. And they preach outside the church, they develop it outside the church, and they bring it in the church and sell it. Well, that royalty would go to them. And so, but the point is, who owns the sermon? It's an intellectual property moment. Who owns the logo? Who owns the website? Some of our churches, have their own bands and want to create an album. Intellectual property rights are flowing, copyright, songwriters agreements, all of that. It's business. I mean, so that's the part. I mean, the ministry is we have a vision, want to create the best album that's ever been created. There's a sound coming out of our house. We feel like the body of Christ needs to know it, and we're going to have an album. Well, what about the poor little congregant who wrote the song? What are his rights? What about the musician, who wrote the words? Does he have any rights? And then you've got the album. Who owns that? These are all business issues, and they're all intellectual property issues. And it's part of doing church, and it's wonderful. It just has to be addressed.
Yeah, I guess it's because I'm not, nor have I ever been really involved in the mega church world, that I really never really even considered these kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, as pastors become celebrities and they're on multiple platforms and they're doing things in multiple media, yeah, there's a whole new world for to consider, all these different books and CDs and films, and yeah, it's a whole different world. Earlier you did talk about private inurement, which in excessive compensation was also included, which I think it could trip up people in the nonprofit world, because like I had a discussion with them, like, well, we can't get compensation. It's like, well, no, that's not what that means. It means that you can't, disproportionately personally profit above what is kind of the norm. And so you need to kind of look at, some benchmarks and make sure that research is documented. And, but, maybe you can dig into that a little bit just to maybe clarify it for some people that are starting a ministry or a CDC or some other nonprofit.
That's a great catch on your part. And there are two hot buttons for the IRS inside a tax exempt organization. One is private inurement, can't take the stuff for myself and just use it for myself. The other is excess compensation. And the operative word there is excess. It's not that you can't be compensated, but it's always going to revolve around what's reasonable in proportion to the church or the ministry that you are getting paid by, reasonable in terms of the actual size of the assets under management, reasonable in terms of comparables to other executives with organizations with the same footprint, the same assets under management as you have. And so, if somebody cries foul and the IRS does an audit and finds out that the executive or executives have been paid too much based on comparable standards, then the penalties are awful. They're draconian. First of all, the executive has to disgorge the excess. The executive and all the board members who allowed him to get paid too much get fined. And in a worst case scenario, they'll take the tax exemption away from the whole enterprise if they don't like, the responses to everybody. So there's a safe harbor, and that's that you can have what's called a compensation study done. And if you have a compensation study done by an independent group, my firm does these for churches all over the country, uh, and ministries. If you have a compensation study done that's done by an outside independent group, and that group comes back doing their comps, doing the metrics, analyzing your financial status, the assets under management, where you are in the country, standard of living, your education, how long you've been there, what contribution you have made to the growth profile of the church that you are being paid by, or the ministry. Then we come back with a recommendation of a comparable range of salaries for that position. If you get that from especially from a law firm that includes a legal opinion letter that says this, the board cannot be held liable for following. It's called the safe harbor. And so, somebody once asked me, well, when should we do this? At what level? And when I was a younger attorney, I asked a guy now my age the same question. I said, well, exactly when is a good idea for an enterprise to do this? And he was a Southern gentleman. He kind of looked at me with kind of a draw and twinkle in his eye. He said, well, Steve, probably when the executive is getting paid more than the IRS judge who's going to be reviewing the case.
Usually a good benchmark, yeah.
And I said, well, what exactly is that? He said, pretty much if total compensation is over $100,000 a year, you should be having a compensation study done. And that, unless there's a major change in growth of the enterprise, that should last you for a good, 5 years or so. But that compensation study is gold under the IRS regulations.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
it's okay to get compensated, just not excessive compensation. And
right.
You need some proof of where you came up with that number.
Yeah, you can't just pull it out of the clear blue sky. And like you said, the ramifications are downright draconian, but to some extent they should be, because otherwise
it's a public trust.
Everybody's creating a not-for-profit just as a pass-through for their own benefit, and then you're just undermining the reason for a nonprofit, which is supposed to be a social good.
A public trust is what it is. Yeah.
I mean, just to maybe get to the last topic would be the importance of succession planning, which oftentimes, the church polity might recommend, this is how we do things, but there are a lot of considerations for independent churches to think about, because oftentimes in a lot of denominations, a pastor might come and go in 2 to 5 years, but in a organically originated church, it's often a family that started the church. The pastor, then his son, were leading the church for 50 years, and maybe there's not a next son. And so what happens beyond, so there's a lot of different scenarios that have to be considered and planned out.
I agree, and that's really good advice. That all of that should be housed in your bylaws. To me, bylaws are like a will for a business. They're going to talk about where things go, who's going to be, how you're going to choose that leader, how you remove a leader, how you pick a leader. All those things should be clarified. And I found in a lot of churches that have done their own documents, the bylaws are full of religious language that has no legal definition to it. So, if they're not following the Bible, we're going to remove. Well, exactly what are you talking about? You know what I mean? Having 10 wives? Are you talking about, which part of the Bible are we talking about here? As opposed to for cause definition. The pastor can be removed for cause, and you list, the pastoral misconduct that you're talking about, which should include fraud, embezzlement, spiritual, moral failing, a whole list of things. It's an objective standard. That protects the pastor, but it also protects, the board, because if they're acting upon that, they have an objective standard. So I think, having it clear how you choose a pastor. We have bylaws. I was just working with a big group out of Chicago right now, and that if a pastor is in good standing and he retires, he can nominate his replacement, but the board still has to approve it. Or if he's not in good standing, then the board will select the next candidate, or the board will throw to a denomination. Like the Assemblies of God might pick, the presbyters for the Potomac district that will come in and do that. My other denomination, in Cleveland, Tennessee, it's hierarchical. So the general presbyter, appoints the presbyter. The presbyter appoints the state or regional overseers. The state and regional overseers appoint the local pastor. And so all of their bylaws, have to follow that line. So it's important that it be defined depending on the polity of the group.
I was pausing there for a second because being Virginia Beach, I had an F-18 flying over my head. But yeah, I mean, to your point, I have a close friend who was a Presbyterian minister for 25 years, and they have a process where, I forget the term they use, but basically the potential candidate as well as the church board both fill out a profile, and then the presbytery matches those profiles. Right. So he went about that process and was appointed to a church, and the board had all sorts of different ideas than were in their profile about what they were looking for. He said, I'm following what was in my profile, and we all agreed this was a match on both. And they're like, well, we're going to do something different. He's like, you can't. I mean, we've set in our agreement and has been signed off on at 3 levels that this is what we both agree we're going to be doing. So, there are these checks and balances that, will happen in a denomination that I think, maybe not to that extent, but in smaller churches, they don't even think through what could happen if our pastor dies. What could happen if we're surprised by, like you said, some moral failing that we have to dismiss him immediately. What do we do from there? We don't have any process in place. And, I think sometimes they think of these things as non-Christian, to have processes and procedures. And no, it's just doing things in a way that are, to your expertise, legal, and to reflect our values. And
I think it's Corinthians that says, "Let everything be done decently and in order." I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that honors the Lord and also honors the stewardship of the resources that have been, before you as a public trust.
Right. Well, I think we had a very productive discussion, and hopefully, somebody out there might find it useful to them. I will give a close up, the business of church. So if you haven't gotten it and you need some of this advice, that's a good first start. I will also tag your name and some contact information after the video. So if anybody needs to get a hold of you, they can.
Great. And off my email would be the best, way to, go ahead and share my information. Okay. I'm not sure because I've changed firms since I wrote the original Business of Church, but I have a new one now. And if you're ever interested, if you get a hold of Bulletproof Business Strategies from the War Zone, if you like that, maybe we can circle back on that another day.
That sounds fun because it sounds like a very interesting book from a lot of interesting experiences.
It's a leadership book, but it's good. It's got some solid principles in it.
I will definitely be getting that and staying in touch. So I just want to thank you sincerely for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you.